He wasn't supposed to be there. Not yet. Not like this. Jonathan Scott, the man who'd negotiated billion-dollar mergers without flinching, who'd stared down senators and CEOs in glass towers overlooking Biscayne Bay, was on his knees in a hospital corridor at 2:17 a.m., shaking so hard he couldn't stand. His $4,000 suit was wrinkled beyond repair. His tie hung loose, forgotten somewhere between the airport and the emergency room entrance. Security had recognized him immediately, everyone in Miami knew his face, but for the first time in his life, privilege wasn't opening doors fast enough. And the look on that nurse's face when he said his son's name? That wasn't professional courtesy. That was pity. Something terrible had already happened. And Jonathan was too late to stop it. But before we dive in, don't just watch, please hit the subscribe button. I'm still fighting my way to our first 1,000 subscribers, and every single click truly keeps this channel alive. And tell me in the comment where in the world you are watching from. Your support inspires us to keep creating more emotional stories of resilience, healing and kindness. The call had come through at 2:03 a.m. Jonathan had been in a Manhattan boardroom, 70 floors above the city, finalizing a pharmaceutical acquisition worth $200 million. His phone vibrated once. Twice. He ignored it. Then his assistant appeared in the doorway, ashen-faced, and Jonathan knew. He didn't ask questions. He just walked out. Left the lawyers mid-sentence. Left the contracts and signed. Left the executive staring at his empty chair. His private jet was already being prepped when he reached Teterboro Airport. The flight attendant saw his expression and didn't say a word. She just buckled in and let him pace the cabin for 2 hours straight, his phone pressed to his ear, trying to get answers no one would give him. "Mr. Scott, we're doing everything we can. Mr. Scott, the doctors are with him now. Mr. Scott, please just get here safely." Every response was a wall. Every voice was too calm, too practiced. And Jonathan had been in enough boardrooms to know what measured tones meant. They were preparing him for the worst. The landing in Miami was rough. Jonathan didn't care. He was down the stairs before the wheels stopped moving, into the waiting Escalade, barking the hospital name at his driver like it was a combat order. HCA Florida Kendall Hospital. ICU. Edward Eric. His son. His foster son. The boy Jonathan had brought into his home 3 years ago, believing he could fix a broken child with money and good intentions. The boy who was now fighting for his life, and Jonathan didn't even know why. The Escalade cut through empty streets at 80 miles per hour. Jonathan's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He tried to remember the last conversation he'd had with Edward. Really had. Not the distracted, "How was school?" over breakfast before a flight. Not the text messages from Tokyo or London or Dubai. A real conversation. He couldn't remember one. The hospital appeared like a cold monument against the dark sky, white concrete, harsh lights, the kind of place where life and death happened in quiet rooms behind locked doors. Jonathan was out of the car before it fully stopped. The automatic doors slid open. Fluorescent lights made everything look too bright, too sharp. A security guard stood near the entrance, older guy, gray hair, the kind who'd worked nights for 20 years. He looked up. Recognized Jonathan immediately. "Mr. Scott," he said, standing straighter. "They told me you were coming." Jonathan barely heard him. He was already moving toward the elevators, toward the ICU, toward wherever Edward was. "Sir," the guard stepped forward. "You need to check in first." "Protocol." Jonathan spun around. His voice came out raw, desperate, nothing like the controlled tone he used in negotiations. "My son. Edward Eric. ICU. Where?" The guard's expression shifted. Not recognition. Concern. "4th floor." "But Mr. Scott, you need to." Jonathan was already at the elevator, slamming the button. The doors opened. He stepped inside. Hit 4. The doors closed. His reflection stared back at him in the polished steel, a man who looked nothing like the billionaire on magazine covers. Just a father. Terrified. Late. The elevator climbed. Jonathan counted every second. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, a nurse was waiting. Young woman, early 30s, scrubs covered in cartoon bears, pediatric ICU staff. Her eyes found his immediately. "Mr. Scott. Where is he?" Jonathan's voice cracked. "Where's Edward?" She stepped forward, hands raised slightly, the universal gesture of calm down, slow down, we've got this under control. But her face told a different story. "Mr. Scott," she said quietly, "Edward is in critical care. The doctor will speak with you shortly. If you'll just—" "I don't want to speak with the doctor. I want to see my son." "I understand, but there are procedures." "I don't care about procedures." The nurse's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. Sympathy. The kind you give someone before delivering news that will shatter them. "Mr. Scott," she said softly, "the doctor will explain everything. Please. Just wait here." She gestured toward a small waiting area, uncomfortable chairs, outdated magazines, a television mounted on the wall playing nothing. Jonathan stared at her. Then at the hallway behind her. Somewhere down that corridor, past locked doors and beeping machines, Edward was lying in a bed, and Jonathan wasn't there. He should have been there. He should have been there months ago. That thought arrived unbidden, unwelcome, a whisper from some part of his mind that already knew the truth. This didn't start tonight. Jonathan's legs gave out. He grabbed the wall for support, his palm flat against cold tile, his breath coming too fast. The nurse reached for him. "Mr. Scott, are you?" "I'm fine." He wasn't. "Just, tell me he's alive." The pause before she answered lasted a lifetime. "He's alive," she said. "But Mr. Scott, you need to prepare yourself." "Prepare? For what?" Jonathan opened his mouth to ask, but footsteps echoed down the hallway. A doctor emerged, older man, gray at the temples, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He wore scrubs and carried a tablet, and when his eyes met Jonathan's, there was no comfort in them. Only truth. "Mr. Scott," the doctor said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Marcus Hensley. We need to talk. Have you ever believed you were doing the right thing, only to realize years later you were blind the entire time? That you missed every warning sign because you were too busy, too confident, too certain your money could solve what only your presence could fix?" Quick flashback. 3 years earlier, Edward Eric had arrived in Jonathan's life through a manila folder and a quiet phone call from Miami-Dade County Foster Services. No cameras. No charity gala. No press release about the billionaire with a heart of gold. Just a 12-year-old boy with a garbage bag of clothes and eyes that had already learned not to hope for anything. The caseworker had been apologetic, almost embarrassed, as she'd explained Edward's history. 7 foster homes in 4 years. Labeled difficult by 3 families. Withdrawn by 2 more. Unresponsive to intervention in the official paperwork. Jonathan had read the file in his office overlooking the bay, the same office where he'd closed deals that moved markets. And he'd made a decision the way he made all decisions, logically, strategically, with full confidence in his ability to succeed where others had failed. He had resources. He had stability. He had a home with extra bedrooms and staff who could provide structure. What Edward needed, Jonathan believed, was simple: consistency, safety, opportunity. What Jonathan didn't understand, what he wouldn't understand until it was almost too late, was that Edward didn't need a benefactor. He needed a father. The first month, Jonathan had assigned Edward the bedroom with the best view. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. Custom furniture. A closet full of expensive clothes Edward never wore. Jonathan hired a private tutor. A therapist who specialized in trauma. A nutritionist to make sure Edward ate properly after years of instability. He threw money at the problem like money was the solution. And Edward? Edward said, "Thank you," when prompted and disappeared into his room every night, closing the door so quietly Jonathan barely heard the click. But Jonathan wasn't worried. The reports were good. The tutor said Edward was making progress. The therapist said he was opening up slowly. The staff said he was adjusting well. Jonathan believed them because he needed to. Because he had meetings in Tokyo, negotiations in London, acquisitions in Dubai that required his attention. Because he'd hired the best people money could buy to care for Edward while he was gone. And they were the best. Background checked. Credentialed. References that read like recommendation letters for sainthood. Especially Marianne Feld. She'd come recommended by 3 separate agencies. Former pediatric nurse. 20 years of experience. Warm smile, gentle voice, the kind of woman who seemed born to care for children. Jonathan had interviewed her personally. Asked about her approach to fostering trust with difficult kids. She'd answered every question perfectly. Children like Edward need patience, she'd said. They need someone who won't give up on them. Someone who'll be there even when they push you away. Jonathan had hired her on the spot. And for 3 years, Marianne Feld had been there. Every day. Every night. Watching Edward while Jonathan traveled the world, building an empire he told himself was for Edward's future. Providing for a child he barely knew. What Jonathan didn't see, what he never thought to look for, were the small things. The way Edward winced sometimes when he stood up too fast. The nights he sat awake at 3 a.m., gripping his chest, too afraid to call out. The headaches he mentioned once, quietly, before learning that Jonathan was too busy to hear about headaches. The mornings Edward said, "I'm fine," when Jonathan asked how he felt, because Edward had learned that, "I'm fine," was the answer that let adults move on with their day. And Jonathan had moved on. Every single time. To boardrooms. To negotiations. To problems he knew how to solve. While Edward got sicker. While someone made sure he stayed quiet. While trust, the one thing Edward needed most, was being slowly, deliberately destroyed. Dr. Marcus Hensley didn't look like a man delivering routine news. He looked like someone who'd spent the last 4 hours fighting death and wasn't sure he'd won. "Mr. Scott," he said, gesturing toward a consultation room away from the waiting area. "We should talk privately." Jonathan followed, his legs moving on autopilot. The room was small, 2 chairs, a desk, a box of tissues on the corner that made Jonathan's stomach drop. They only put tissues out when they expect you to break. Dr. Hensley closed the door. Sat down. Placed his tablet on the desk between them but didn't look at it. He looked at Jonathan. "Your foster son collapsed at home around 11 p.m., he began. "Severe respiratory distress. Loss of consciousness. The school counselor found him, she'd stopped by to drop off some assignments. If she'd been 5 minutes later." He didn't finish the sentence. Jonathan's mouth was dry. "But he's stable now." "You said he's alive." "He's alive," Dr. Hensley confirmed. "We've intubated him. His oxygen levels are improving." "But Mr. Scott." The pause was too long. "What?" Jonathan demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" Dr. Hensley leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "When your son arrived, we ran a full panel. Standard protocol for this kind of respiratory collapse. And we found some things that concern us." "What things?" "Edward's lung capacity is significantly compromised. His blood work shows markers consistent with chronic exposure to respiratory suppressants. And there are signs, physical signs, that this condition didn't start today. Or even last week. Jonathan felt the room tilt. "I don't understand," he said, though part of him was beginning to. "How long are we talking about?" Dr. Hensley met his eyes. "Based on what we're seeing. Months. Possibly longer." The word hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Months. Edward had been sick for months. And Jonathan hadn't known. Hadn't seen it. Hadn't been there to see it. "That's not possible," Jonathan said, his voice hollow. "I get reports. Weekly updates from his tutor, his therapist, the household staff. No one said he was sick. No one said anything was wrong. Did Edward tell you he was sick?" The question landed like an accusation. Jonathan opened his mouth. Closed it. When was the last time Edward had told him anything? "He said he was fine," Jonathan whispered. "Every time I asked, he said he was fine." Dr. Hensley's expression softened, but only slightly. "Mr. Scott, children who've been through trauma, especially children in the foster system, learn very quickly that adults don't always want to hear the truth. They learn to say, 'I'm fine,' because it's easier. Because it keeps people from sending them away." Jonathan's hands started shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs, trying to stop it. "So he was suffering," Jonathan said slowly, "and he didn't tell me because he thought I'd, what? Get rid of him?" "I can't speak to Edward's thought process. I can only tell you what we're seeing medically." "Which is?" Dr. Hensley picked up his tablet. Pulled up a chart covered in numbers Jonathan didn't understand. "Your son's condition is serious. But what's more concerning is the pattern. This wasn't sudden illness. This was gradual, progressive decline. The kind of thing that should have been caught during routine checkups." "He had checkups," Jonathan said quickly. "Monthly. I made sure of it." "Who took him to those appointments?" "My assistant coordinated them. The household staff, Mary Ann, his primary caregiver, she handled transportation." Dr. Hensley made a note on his tablet. "And the reports from those visits?" "Always clean. No issues. Healthy kid." The doctor's expression shifted. "Just slightly. But enough. Mr. Scott," he said carefully, "we need to run more tests. But there's something else you should know." Jonathan's chest tightened. "What?" "The respiratory suppressants we found in Edward's system, they're not recreational drugs. They're not something a teenager would typically have access to. They're medications used in clinical settings, under strict supervision." "You're saying someone gave them to him?" "I'm saying the levels we're seeing suggest prolonged, consistent exposure. And this type of suppression doesn't happen by accident." The room went silent. Jonathan heard his own heartbeat. Heard the ventilation system overhead. Heard the distant beep of machines keeping his son alive down the hallway. "You think someone poisoned him," Jonathan said. Not a question. A statement. Dr. Hensley didn't flinch. "I think we need to investigate every possibility. Including that one." Jonathan stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "I need to see him. Now." "Of course. But Mr. Scott." "What?" The doctor stood, meeting Jonathan's eyes. "When you go in there, remember, he's fighting. He's been fighting for a long time. Alone." The implication was clear. "Where were you?" Jonathan had no answer. He followed Dr. Hensley down the hallway, past rooms where other families waited, other children struggled, other lives hung in balance. They stopped at a door marked ICU 7. "He's intubated," Dr. Hensley warned. "He can't speak. But there's evidence he can hear. So talk to him. Let him know you're here." Jonathan pushed open the door. And saw his son for the first time in 3 weeks. Edward looked smaller than Jonathan remembered. Younger. The breathing tube obscured half his face. Machines surrounded the bed, monitors, 4 lines, tubes carrying fluids Jonathan couldn't name. But it was Edward's hands that broke him. Small. Pale. Lying still on top of the white hospital blanket. The hands of a child who'd spent months suffering in silence. Jonathan crossed the room. Pulled a chair close to the bed. And for the first time in 3 years, he took his son's hand and didn't let go. Edward's skin was cold. "I'm here," Jonathan whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't here before. I'm sorry I didn't see. I'm sorry for everything." The machines beeped steadily. Edward didn't move. But Jonathan felt it, just barely, a slight pressure against his palm. Edward's fingers, tightening. Just a fraction. Just enough. Dr. Hensley appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Scott," he said quietly. "There's one more thing we need to discuss." Jonathan didn't let go of Edward's hand. "What?" "The exposure pattern, it's too consistent to be environmental. Someone had regular, direct access to your son. Someone who knew what they were doing." Jonathan's blood turned to ice. "Who?" "That's what we need to figure out." "But Mr. Scott, whoever it was, they were in your home." Jonathan couldn't move. Couldn't process what Dr. Hensley had just said. Someone in his home. Someone with access to Edward. Someone he trusted. His mind raced through faces. The chef who prepared meals. The housekeepers who cleaned Edward's room. The tutor who came 3 times a week. The driver who took Edward to appointments. Marianne. The name arrived like a knife. Marianne Feld. 20 years of experience. Perfect references. Warm smile. The woman Jonathan had personally hired to care for Edward while he traveled the world. "I need names," Jonathan said, his voice hard. "Everyone who had access to my son. Everyone on my staff. I want a full list." Dr. Hensley nodded. "We'll be cooperating with authorities on this. Child Protective Services has already been notified. They'll want to interview your household staff. I'll handle my staff. Mr. Scott, this is a potential criminal investigation." "I said I'll handle it." The doctor studied him for a moment. Then nodded slowly. "Your son needs you present right now more than he needs you investigating. Let the professionals do their job." But Jonathan wasn't listening anymore. His phone was already out. He scrolled to his head of security, Marcus Reed, former Secret Service, the kind of man who asked questions later. The call connected on the first ring. "Mr. Scott. I need you at the house. Now. Lock it down. No one leaves. No one enters. Pull all security footage from the last 6 months. Every camera, every entry log, every movement." "Sir, what's?" "Someone hurt Edward. Someone in my house. Find out who." He ended the call. Looked back at his son, lying motionless in the hospital bed. 3 years. Jonathan had given Edward a home, resources, opportunity. Everything except the one thing that mattered. Attention. Presence. Protection. "I should have known," Jonathan whispered, still holding Edward's hand. "I should have seen you were in pain." A memory surfaced, 3 months ago, maybe 4. Edward at breakfast, pushing his eggs around his plate, barely eating. Jonathan had been on his laptop, reviewing acquisition documents. "You okay?" Jonathan had asked, not looking up. "Yeah. Just tired." "Get more sleep then. School's important." "Okay." That was it. 30 seconds of conversation before Jonathan left for the airport. He'd missed it. Missed the exhaustion that wasn't just about sleep. Missed the way Edward barely touched his food anymore. Missed the fact that his son was disappearing right in front of him and Jonathan had been too busy to notice. Another memory, 6 weeks ago. Jonathan home for 3 days between London and Singapore. Edward had mentioned a headache. Jonathan had told him to take Tylenol. Did you tell Marianne? Jonathan had asked. Yeah. Good. She'll take care of it. She'll take care of it. Jonathan's stomach turned. What if Marianne hadn't been taking care of it? What if she'd been causing it? Dr. Hensley returned, this time with a nurse, different one, older, with kind eyes and a clipboard. We need to run more tests, the doctor said. Blood work, tissue samples, full toxicology. It'll take a few hours. Do whatever you need to do. The nurse approached the bed, checking Edward's 4-line, adjusting the flow rate on one of the machines. He's stable, she said gently. Heart rate's good. Oxygen saturation is improving. He's a fighter. Jonathan nodded, unable to speak. The nurse touched his shoulder, brief, professional, but somehow personal. Kids like Edward, she said quietly, they don't give up easy. They've survived too much to quit now. She left. Dr. Hensley remained. Mr. Scott, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Jonathan looked up. Did Edward ever try to tell you he was sick? Even once? The question cut deeper than any diagnosis. Jonathan thought back. Searched his memory for moments he'd been too distracted to notice. And then he remembered. 2 months ago. Late night. Jonathan had been home, working in his study. Edward had appeared in the doorway, 14 years old but looking younger in his oversized pajamas. Can I talk to you? Jonathan had glanced up from his computer. It's late, buddy. School tomorrow. I know, but... Everything okay? Edward had hesitated. Just for a second. Yeah. Never mind. Good night. Good night. Edward had left. And Jonathan had gone back to work. He tried, Jonathan said now, his voice breaking. He tried to tell me. And I didn't listen. Dr. Hensley didn't offer empty comfort. He just nodded. The good news is we caught this before permanent damage occurred. The bad news is we're still figuring out exactly what we're dealing with. And until we know who did this and why, Edward remains at risk. What do you mean, at risk? I mean if someone went to this much effort to harm your son, we can't assume they've stopped trying. The implication was clear. Edward wasn't safe. Not yet. Jonathan stood, pacing the small room, his mind racing through logistics, security protocols, legal options. I want private security outside this door. 24/7. No one gets in without my approval. Mr. Scott, this is a hospital. We have protocols. I don't care about protocols. My son was poisoned under my own roof by someone I trusted. I'm not taking chances. Dr. Hensley considered this. Then nodded. I'll clear it with administration. But you need to understand, if this is truly criminal, you're going to have to cooperate with law enforcement. You can't handle this alone. Watch me. Jonathan's phone buzzed. Marcus Reed. He answered. Talk to me. Sir, we've got a problem. Security footage from the house, there are gaps. Hours missing from the last 3 months. Someone deleted files. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Who had access to the security system? Only senior staff. And one other person. Who? Marianne Feld. You gave her admin access last year when you upgraded the system. Said you wanted her to be able to check on Edward when you were traveling. Jonathan closed his eyes. He'd done this. He'd given her the tools to hurt his son while covering her tracks. Find her, Jonathan said. Now. Already on it. But sir, she hasn't been to work since yesterday morning. Her phone's off. Her apartment's empty. Marianne was gone. Which meant she knew they were coming. Which meant someone had warned her. Jonathan ended the call. Looked at Dr. Hensley. The woman who did this, Jonathan said slowly, she's disappeared. Which means she either acted alone and ran. Or she's working for someone, Dr. Hensley finished. Someone who doesn't want Edward talking. The machines around Edward's bed continued their steady rhythm. Beep. 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 Evidence that his heart was still fighting. Jonathan returned to the chair. Took Edward's hand again. I'm not leaving, he whispered. Not again. I don't care what you know or who wants you quiet. I'm staying right here. Edward's fingers twitched. Just barely. But it was enough. At this point, Jonathan knows Edward was poisoned. He knows someone in his own home did this. Someone he paid. Someone he trusted. But here's what he doesn't know yet, and maybe you've already figured it out. Who wanted Edward silenced? And why would anyone go this far to hurt a foster kid from Miami-Dade County? By dawn, Jonathan's Coral Gables mansion looked like a crime scene. Which, technically, it was. Marcus Reed had arrived with a team of private investigators, former FBI, former DEA, the kind of people who knew how to find answers without waiting for warrants. Jonathan had made one thing clear, he didn't care about legal boundaries. He cared about truth. They started in Edward's bedroom. The room Jonathan had designed to be perfect. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Custom furniture. A space that screamed wealth and privilege. A space where a child had been systematically poisoned. Reed's team worked methodically. Photographed everything. Bagged evidence. Pulled up floorboards and checked air vents. And then they found the first piece. Mr. Scott, Reed called from Edward's bathroom. You need to see this. Jonathan crossed the room. Reed was crouched beside the sink, holding a small prescription bottle in his gloved hand. Lorazepam, Reed said. Prescribed to a Marianne Feld. But look at the date. Jonathan leaned closer. The prescription was from 18 months ago. The bottle was nearly empty. Lorazepam's a sedative, Reed explained. Used for anxiety. In controlled doses, it's safe. But in higher doses, over time, it suppresses respiratory function. Jonathan's hands curled into fists. She was drugging him. Looks that way. But here's the thing, this prescription is legitimate. Issued by a licensed doctor in Aventura. Which means either she was sharing her medication with Edward. Or someone told her to. Reed nodded. We found 3 more bottles. Hidden in the bathroom cabinet, behind cleaning supplies. Different medications, all respiratory suppressants, all prescribed to Marianne Feld. Jonathan stared at the bottles. Such small things. Such devastating consequences. Where is she? Still looking. But we pulled her financials. She received wire transfers every month for the last 2 years. Amounts ranging from $5,000 to $15,000. Always from an offshore account. Someone was paying her. Someone was paying her well. Her salary from you was $80,000 a year. These transfers add up to over $200,000. Jonathan's mind raced. Who had that kind of money? Who had reason to hurt Edward? Pull the security footage, Jonathan ordered. Everything from the last 6 months. I want to see every time Marianne entered Edward's room. Reed nodded to one of his team members, who pulled out a laptop. The footage loaded. Time stamps from midnight to 6 a.m. Marianne's movements tracked across multiple cameras. What they saw made Jonathan sick. Marianne entering Edward's room at 11 p.m. staying for 20 minutes. Leaving with nothing in her hands. Again at 2 a.m. same pattern. Again at 4 a.m. 3 times a night. Every night for months. What was she doing in there? Jonathan whispered. Reed fast-forwarded to a clearer angle. Zoomed in. They watched Marianne approach Edward's bed. Watched her pull something from her pocket. Watched her lean over the sleeping child. Jonathan couldn't breathe. She was medicating him, Reed said quietly. While he slept. He probably never even knew. The laptop showed date after date. Night after night. Months of systematic poisoning, recorded but never noticed because Jonathan had never thought to check. He'd trusted the system. Trusted the people he'd paid. And his son had paid the price. I want her found, Jonathan said, his voice deadly calm. I don't care what it costs. I don't care where she ran. Find her. Reed's phone rang. He answered, listened, then looked at Jonathan with an expression that said this gets worse. What? Jonathan demanded. My contact at Miami-Dade pulled Edward's sealed foster records. The ones you weren't allowed to see when you took placement. And? Edward's biological father was David Eric. Ring any bells? Jonathan searched his memory. The name felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. Should it? David Eric was a clinical research associate at Meridian Therapeutics. Pharmaceutical company. 8 years ago, he blew the whistle on fraudulent trial data. Said the company was falsifying results to fast-track FDA approval for a cardiac drug. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Meridian Therapeutics. He knew that name. Before the case could go to trial, Reed continued, David Eric died in a car accident. Single vehicle collision, ruled mechanical failure. His son, Edward, was placed in foster care. He was 7 years old. Jonathan's mind was spinning. Why does Meridian sound familiar? Reed pulled out his phone. Showed Jonathan a news article from 5 years ago. Because your investment group owns 18% of Meridian Therapeutics. You've been a major shareholder since 2020. The room tilted. Jonathan grabbed the desk for support. I don't manage those investments directly. My advisors handle. Your advisors put you in business with the company that silenced Edward's father. And now Edward's in your house. Jonathan's blood ran cold. You're saying Edward wasn't a random placement. I'm saying 7-year-old orphans don't end up in the homes of billionaire investors by accident. Someone wanted him close. Someone wanted him watched. Why? He was a child. He couldn't testify. He didn't know anything. Reed's expression darkened. Unless he did. Unless his father told him something before he died. Unless Edward has been sitting on information that could destroy Meridian Therapeutics for the last 7 years. Jonathan felt like he was drowning. I've been housing the son of a whistleblower. A whistleblower who exposed a company I'm invested in. A company that might have killed his father. Yeah. The pieces were falling into place. Horrible, devastating pieces. Edward hadn't been placed with Jonathan to be saved. He'd been placed to be controlled. And when Edward got older, when he started asking questions, when he became a liability instead of an asset, someone decided to silence him permanently. Jonathan's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered without thinking. Mr. Scott. The voice was calm, professional, unfamiliar. You're asking dangerous questions about a closed matter. Jonathan's entire body went rigid. Who is this? Someone who would prefer Edward Eric remain comfortable and quiet. For his sake and yours. If you touch him again. I don't need to touch him, Mr. Scott. You've already done the work for me. You hired the caregiver. You signed the placement papers. You gave her access to your home, your security system, your foster son. Jonathan's vision blurred with rage. What do you want? I want you to stop investigating. I want you to accept that Edward had a tragic medical episode. I want you to remember that you're a very visible man with a reputation to protect. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a choice. Walk away, and Edward lives a long, quiet life. Keep digging, and you'll discover there are consequences for people who don't know when to stop. The line went dead. Jonathan stood frozen, phone still pressed to his ear. Reed was watching him. What did they say? They said to stop asking questions. You going to listen? Jonathan thought about Edward. Thought about a 7-year-old boy losing his father. Thought about the same boy, 7 years later, being poisoned in his own bed. Thought about trust, and money, and the people who believe wealth makes them untouchable. No, Jonathan said. I'm not stopping. I'm going to burn down everyone involved. Reed smiled grimly. Good. Because I just got a hit on Mary Ann Feld's credit card. She's at Miami International Airport. Jonathan was already moving toward the door. Then let's go have a conversation. They didn't make it to the airport. Halfway there, Reed's phone rang again. He listened, his expression hardening, then hung up without a word. She's gone, he said flatly. Boarded a flight to Sao Paulo 20 minutes ago. Private charter. Paid in cash. Jonathan slammed his fist against the dashboard. Someone warned her. Someone knew we were coming. Someone with resources. Someone who's been 3 steps ahead this entire time. Jonathan's mind was racing. The phone call. The threat. The systematic cover-up. This wasn't just about Edward anymore. This was about something bigger. Something that had cost David Eric his life 7 years ago. Something worth killing a child to protect. Take me back to the house, Jonathan said. I need to see Edward's foster records. All of them. Reed made a U-turn. 20 minutes later, Jonathan was in his study, surrounded by documents Reed's team had pulled, sealed records, court filings, newspaper articles about David Eric's death. The picture that emerged was damning. David Eric had been a nobody. A mid-level research associate at Meridian Therapeutics, working on clinical trials for a cardiac drug called Vascudex. The drug was supposed to prevent heart attacks in high-risk patients. Worth billions if it got FDA approval. But David had found something wrong in the data. Mortality rates that didn't match reported outcomes. Adverse events that disappeared from final reports. Patients who died during trials but were listed as lost to follow-up. David had done what whistleblowers do. He'd collected evidence. Filed complaints with the FDA. Contacted journalists. And then, 6 weeks before his testimony was scheduled, his car had gone off the road on a rainy night in Homestead. Single vehicle accident. Brake failure. No witnesses. The investigation had ruled it mechanical failure. The case against Meridian had died with him. And his 7-year-old son had become a ward of the state. Jonathan stared at the timeline. Edward had bounced through 7 foster homes in 4 years. Each placement lasting a few months before something went wrong. The files were vague: behavioral issues, attachment problems, failure to thrive. But now Jonathan saw it differently. Edward hadn't been difficult. Edward had been moved. Deliberately. Systematically. Kept unstable, kept vulnerable, kept from forming connections that might make him talk. Until 3 years ago, when he'd been placed with Jonathan Scott. Billionaire. Investor. Public figure. And, Jonathan's stomach turned, major shareholder in Meridian Therapeutics. They put him here, Jonathan said aloud. They wanted him in my house. Reed looked up from his laptop. Why? If they wanted him dead, there are easier ways. Because killing a foster kid raises questions. But a foster kid who dies in the care of a billionaire investor? That's just tragic negligence. I take the fall. Edward silenced. And whoever's really responsible walks away clean. Reed's expression darkened. That's cold. That's strategic. Jonathan pulled up his investment portfolio on his computer. Found Meridian Therapeutics. Clicked through to the board of directors. And there, third name from the top, was someone he recognized. Gerald Hartwick. One of Jonathan's oldest advisors. The man who'd managed his pharmaceutical investments for a decade. The man who'd recommended the Meridian position 5 years ago, calling it a sure thing. The man who had access to Jonathan's home security codes. Jonathan's hand started shaking. I know who's behind this. Reed moved closer. Who? Gerald Hartwick. He's been my financial advisor since 2015. He manages my entire pharmaceutical portfolio. And he's on Meridian's board. Reed pulled up Hartwick's information. His expression went grim. Mr. Scott, Hartwick wasn't just on the board. He was Meridian's chief financial officer when David Eric filed his complaint. He's named in the original FDA filing as someone who had direct access to the trial data. Jonathan felt sick. He knew David Eric. He knew what David was going to expose. And when I took placement of Edward 3 years ago, Hartwick saw an opportunity, Reed finished. Put Edward in your care. Control the environment. And if Edward ever became a problem, make it look like your negligence killed him. Jonathan stood, pacing. His entire world was collapsing. He'd trusted Hartwick. Had dinner with him. Took his advice on billions of dollars in investments. And the whole time, Hartwick had been using him. Setting him up. Preparing him to be the fall guy for a murder that had been 7 years in the making. Where's Hartwick now? Reed checked his phone. According to his assistant, he's at his office in Brickell. Want me to call Miami PD? No. Jonathan grabbed his jacket. I'm handling this myself. Mr. Scott, that's not. I don't care. This man put my son in danger. He hired someone to poison a child in my own home. He tried to make me an accomplice to murder. Jonathan's voice was ice. I'm going to look him in the eye when I destroy him. Jonathan's Escalade pulled up to the glass tower in Brickell at 10 a.m. Hartwick Capital Management occupied the entire 32nd floor. Corner office. View of the bay. The kind of place that screamed success and stability. The kind of place that hid monsters in tailored suits. Jonathan bypassed the receptionist, ignoring her protests as he walked straight to Hartwick's office. Reed followed 2 steps behind, hand near his concealed weapon. The door was open. Gerald Hartwick sat behind a mahogany desk, silver hair perfectly combed, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as Jonathan entered. And he smiled. Jonathan. I was expecting you. That stopped Jonathan cold. You knew I was coming. Of course. You're predictable. Emotional. That's always been your weakness. Hartwick closed the file he'd been reading. Please, sit. I'll stand. Hartwick shrugged. Suit yourself. I assume you figured it out by now. David Eric. Meridian. The placement. Very clever of you, though I wish you'd taken my advice and stopped asking questions. Jonathan's fists clenched. You killed him. You killed David Eric and then you spent 7 years making sure his son couldn't expose you. I didn't kill anyone, Hartwick said calmly. David Eric died in a car accident. Tragic, really. He was a good researcher. Just didn't understand how business works. And Edward? Edward was insurance. As long as he was alive and controlled, the past stayed buried. But you, Hartwick's smile faded. You were supposed to keep him controlled. Instead, you ignored him. Traveled the world. Made it easy for Marianne to do her job. Her job was to murder a child. Her job was to keep him manageable. The respiratory issues were, let's call them a happy accident. If Edward had died quietly in your care, we'd have called it tragic negligence. Your reputation would have taken a hit. And Meridian's secrets would have stayed buried. Jonathan took a step forward. Reed's hand tightened on his weapon. You're admitting to attempted murder. I'm admitting nothing. I'm simply explaining reality to someone who's been willfully blind for 3 years. Hartwick leaned back in his chair. You never asked questions, Jonathan. Never wondered why a random foster placement ended up in your home. Never thought it was strange that I recommended you take the boy in. Jonathan's blood ran cold. You recommended it? Through intermediaries, of course. Made sure the caseworker knew you were looking to foster. Made sure Edward's file crossed your desk at exactly the right time. You thought you were being a hero. You were being a puppet. The room felt too small. Too hot. Why? Jonathan demanded. Why go through all this? If you wanted Edward dead, why not just? Because dead foster kids attract attention. But a dead foster kid in the care of a negligent billionaire? That's just another tragedy. Another story about wealth and privilege failing to protect the vulnerable. You'd have been ruined. And Edward would have been forgotten. Hartwick stood, adjusting his cufflinks. Unfortunately, that school counselor found him too soon. And now you're here, playing detective, thinking you can bring me down. I don't think I can bring you down, Jonathan said quietly. I know I can. Hartwick laughed. With what? Conspiracy theories? Hearsay. Marianne's long gone. There's no evidence connecting me to anything. And even if there were, he gestured around his office. I have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers. Judges. Politicians. People who owe me favors. I don't need favors, Jonathan said. I need the truth. He pulled out his phone. Hit play on a recording. Hartwick's voice filled the room. Her job was to keep him manageable. The respiratory issues were a happy accident. Hartwick's face went pale. You're recording this? Miami's a one-party consent state, Reed said, stepping forward. Which means Mr. Scott just got everything he needed. Hartwick's composure cracked. That recording won't hold up in court. My lawyers will. I don't need it to hold up in court, Jonathan interrupted. I need it for the FBI. The DA. The FDA. Every agency that's been wanting to reopen the investigation into David Eric's death. He sent the recording to 3 different email addresses with a single tap. And now they have it. Hartwick's expression shifted from arrogance to calculation in seconds. You have no idea what you've just done. I've done what I should have done 3 years ago. Protected my son. Jonathan turned to leave. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Text message. Meridian has friends everywhere. Even in hospitals. Jonathan's heart stopped. He looked at Reed. The hospital. Edward. They ran. By the time they reached HCA Kendall Hospital, every alarm in the ICU was screaming. Jonathan burst through the doors, security trying to stop him, nurses shouting his name. He didn't care. He ran toward ICU room 7. The door was open. Inside, 2 security guards had a man pinned to the floor, mid-30s, dressed in hospital maintenance uniform, struggling against their grip. Edward's bed was surrounded by medical staff. Dr. Hensley was barking orders. Machines were beeping too fast, too urgent. What happened? Jonathan shouted. One of his private security guards, the one he'd stationed outside Edward's room, pointed at the man on the floor. He tried to access the 4-line. Had a syringe in his pocket. Jonathan's vision went red. He lunged toward the man, but Reed grabbed him, held him back. Let the police handle it, Reed said firmly. The man on the floor looked up. Met Jonathan's eyes. And smiled. You can't stop this, he said calmly. They'll try again. And again. Until the job's done. Jonathan broke free from Reed's grip. Got in the man's face. Who sent you? The man's smile widened. Ask Gerald Hartwick. Oh wait, you can't. He's already on a plane to Grand Cayman. Jonathan's blood froze. Hartwick had run. Which meant he'd known the hospital was compromised before Jonathan even left his office. Which meant there were more people involved than Jonathan had imagined. Dr. Hensley approached, his expression grave. Mr. Scott, we need to move Edward. Now. This facility isn't secure. Where? I have a colleague at Jackson Memorial. Private wing. Limited access. We can transfer him there within the hour. Jonathan looked at his son. Edward was still unconscious, still intubated, still fighting for every breath. But his fingers, Jonathan saw it, his fingers were moving. Twitching. Grasping at the blanket. Like he was trying to hold on. Do it, Jonathan said. Whatever it takes. Move him. Dr. Hensley nodded. The team mobilized immediately. Jonathan stayed by Edward's bed as they prepared for transport. He took his son's hand one more time. I'm not leaving you, he whispered. I promise. Never again. Edward's fingers tightened around his. Barely. But real. Jonathan felt tears on his face and didn't bother wiping them away. Behind him, Miami PD was taking the would-be assassin into custody. Reed was coordinating with federal agents. The hospital was being locked down. But Jonathan didn't care about any of that. He cared about the small hand in his. The slight pressure that said his son was still here. Still fighting. Still trusting him, despite everything. We're going to get through this, Jonathan said. Both of us. I swear it. The machines beeped steadily. The chaos continued around them. But in that moment, in that small ICU room, it was just a father and his son. And for the first time in 3 years, Jonathan was finally present. 6 weeks later, Edward opened his eyes without machines breathing for him. The transfer to Jackson Memorial had worked. Private wing. Limited access. Armed guards that Jonathan personally vetted. No one got near Edward without passing through 3 security checkpoints and a background check that would make the Secret Service jealous. Jonathan had learned his lesson about trust. The federal investigation had moved fast once the recording surfaced. Gerald Hartwick had been arrested at Grand Cayman International Airport, extradited back to Miami, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and about 15 other felonies that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Marianne Feld had been found in Sao Paulo and was fighting extradition. It was only a matter of time. Meridian Therapeutics stock had collapsed. The FDA had reopened the investigation into David Eric's death. 3 board members had resigned. 2 more had been indicted. Jonathan's investment portfolio had taken a massive hit. He didn't care. He'd sold his shares in Meridian immediately. Donated the proceeds to foster care reform organizations. Cut ties with every advisor who'd been anywhere near the company. Lost roughly $200 million in the process. It was the best money he'd ever spent. What mattered was sitting up in bed right now, breathing on his own, looking at Jonathan with confused but present eyes. Dad? The word was rough. Edward's throat was still healing from the intubation. But it was clear. Dad. Not Mr. Scott. Not Jonathan. Dad. Jonathan moved closer. Sat in the chair he'd occupied for 6 weeks straight. Hey, buddy. How are you feeling? Edward looked around the room, at the monitors, the 4 lines, the security guard visible through the glass door. What happened? Jonathan had prepared for this question. Dr. Hensley had warned him Edward's memories might be fragmented. That he might not remember everything. But Edward deserved the truth. Someone tried to hurt you, Jonathan said carefully. Someone I trusted. Someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near you. Edward's expression didn't change. Like he wasn't surprised. Marianne. Jonathan's heart clenched. You knew. I knew something was wrong. I just. Edward looked down at his hands. I didn't think anyone would believe me. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Why wouldn't I believe you? Edward met his eyes. And in that look, Jonathan saw years of hurt, years of learning that adults don't always listen, that speaking up sometimes makes things worse. Because you were never there. Jonathan felt tears burn his eyes. He didn't try to stop them. You're right. I wasn't. I thought providing for you was the same as protecting you. I thought money could solve everything. I was wrong. Edward was quiet for a long moment. Are you going to send me back? The question broke Jonathan completely. Send you back where? To foster care. That's what always happens. Something goes wrong, and they send you somewhere else. Jonathan stood. Moved to sit on the edge of Edward's bed. Took his son's hand, something he should have done years ago. I'm not sending you anywhere. I'm adopting you. Legally. Permanently. Not as a foster arrangement. As my son. Edward stared at him. Why? Because I love you. Because I should have told you that 3 years ago. Because you're not a responsibility or a charity case or someone else's problem. You're my son. And I'm sorry it took almost losing you to figure that out. Edward's eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink them away, the way kids do when they've learned that crying doesn't change anything. But Jonathan pulled him close. Held him the way he should have held him 1,000 times before. It's okay to cry, Jonathan whispered. It's okay to be hurt. It's okay to be angry with me. I deserve all of it. Edward's small frame shook against him. Years of pain coming out in ragged sobs. And Jonathan held on. Didn't let go. Didn't check his phone or glance at his watch or think about meetings he was missing. He just stayed. Because that's what fathers do. Over the next 3 weeks, Edward's condition improved steadily. The respiratory damage was healing. His appetite returned. The nightmares, and there were many, slowly became less frequent. Dr. Hensley cleared him for transfer to a rehabilitation facility where he could work on regaining strength. Jonathan arranged everything. Then arranged to go with him. He'd resigned from 4 corporate boards. Turned down 3 acquisition opportunities. Cancelled every international trip on his calendar for the next year. His assistant had asked if he was sure. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Jonathan had told her. Because Edward needed him. Not his money. Not his connections. Him. They worked together through physical therapy. Jonathan learned to read medical charts so he could understand Edward's progress. Learned to cook because Edward mentioned missing home-cooked meals. Learned to just sit quietly when Edward didn't want to talk. Learned to be present. One afternoon, 3 weeks into rehab, Edward asked the question Jonathan had been waiting for. What happened to my real dad? Jonathan had known this was coming. Had prepared with Dr. Hensley and a therapist about how to handle it. But preparation didn't make it easier. Your dad was a brave man, Jonathan said carefully. He saw something wrong at the company he worked for. Something dangerous. And he tried to stop it. Did they kill him? No point lying. Edward was 14. He'd already survived too much to accept comfortable fiction. We think so. The investigation is ongoing. But Edward, your dad died trying to do the right thing. Trying to protect people. That takes courage. Edward was quiet, processing. Is that why they tried to hurt me? Because of what my dad knew? Yes. Did you know? When you took me in? No. I didn't know anything. I thought I was just helping a kid who needed a home. I didn't realize. Jonathan's voice caught. I didn't realize you were in danger because of me. Because of my investments. Because I wasn't paying attention. Edward looked at him. Really looked at him. But you're paying attention now. Every second. And I'm never stopping. Edward nodded slowly. Then, quietly, good. The federal trial was set for 8 months out. Edward would have to testify eventually. Not about what his father knew, he'd been too young to understand any of that. But about what Marianne had done. About the nights she'd come into his room. About the way she'd made him feel like speaking up would only make things worse. The prosecutors promised they'd make it as easy as possible. Jonathan promised he'd be there for every second of it. In the meantime, they focused on healing. On building something that should have been built 3 years ago. Trust. 3 months after the hospital, Edward took his first walk without assistance. Early morning at the rehab facility. Edward's steps were careful but steady. Jonathan stayed close, not hovering, just present. I've been thinking about what happens next, Edward said. After the trial. After all this. What do you want to happen? Edward stopped at the window, watching the Miami sunrise. I want to finish school. Go to college. Maybe study medicine. He hesitated. But I also want to understand what my dad died for. I want to know if it mattered. It mattered, Jonathan said firmly. Your dad saved lives. The investigation he started is exposing fraud that could have killed thousands. That matters. But he didn't get to see it. They stood in silence. Then Edward asked the question that had been hovering between them for months. Are we safe now? Jonathan wanted to lie. Wanted to promise absolute safety. But Edward deserved honesty. I don't know. Hartwick's in jail. Marianne's being extradited. Meridian's being dismantled. But there are still people who'd prefer this story stayed buried. Still people who see you as a threat. So we're not safe. We're safer. And I'm not leaving. That's the difference. Edward searched his face. You promise? Even if it's hard? Even if it costs you everything? Especially then. You're more important than any deal. Any amount of money. I should have known that 3 years ago. I know it now. Edward nodded. Started walking again. Jonathan walked beside him. Edward's 15th birthday. Quiet dinner at the new home in Coconut Grove, smaller, safer, no memories of what happened before. After the guests left, Jonathan and Edward sat on the patio watching boats drift across the bay. Johns Hopkins has a good pre-med program, Edward said. But it's in Baltimore. Jonathan understood. Baltimore was far from home. Far from their carefully built security. You scared? A little. Me too. But you should do whatever you want. And I'll figure out how to let you. Edward smiled. We're pretty messed up, huh? Yeah. But we're messed up together. That counts for something. Outside, the sun set over Biscayne Bay. Security cameras tracked everything. The world remained dangerous. But inside, a father held his son and kept the promise that mattered most. The promise to stay. No matter what.